Hey buddy, what's your name? I'm going to call you Ferrari because you are moving fast.
Oh, sorry, I was just exploring my terrarium. I've got a few snails in here, a few other critters as well, and of course thousands more in the soil if I went in with a microscope. Welcome to this course on biodiversity. The bio in biodiversity comes from the Greek bios, for life. So this course is all about the variety of life and the impact our human activities are having on it. In this course, we're also going to start by looking back to get a sense of the time it took for life to evolve and of its diversity. That will give us the understanding we need to see the impact on the loss of that biodiversity. To this day, our planet, Earth, is the only planet in the solar system, in the universe, that we have found life on. But that appearance of life and the diversity we now see is the result of billions of years of evolution. The first signs of life probably appeared 600 million years after the formation of our planet. We estimate that because the first fossils we discovered appeared 1 billion years after the Earth formed. Since then, life has spread pretty much everywhere, from the bottom of the oceans to the top of the mountains and into some of the most inhospitable of places on the planet. We humans are part of this living world, but remember, our species, Homo sapiens, appeared at just 7 seconds to midnight in that 24-hour story from Earth's formation to now. Here's another way to picture that timeline. The distance between the tip of my nose and my hand, this is Earth time. Okay, the planet formed here, and this is now, and that quick stroke just erased the whole of human history. So let's not focus only on our story, but the story of the whole planet and what else calls it home. And the sad truth is that we are blind to most of that life. Here in the terrarium, out in a forest, next to a pond, even in our back garden. I can hear the birds, but I can't understand their language or the detailed interconnections between species. The world we are living in is alien to us. And that, in part, is what is leading us to a massive biological collapse. My aim in this course is to open your eyes, to get a better view of the living world, to see what is sometimes hidden, because our existence relies on the existence of this vast, incredible biodiversity. Let's start with a big question, one that could be as much philosophy as it is science. What defines life? I'll go for the science answer because I'm hotter on that than the philosophy. What is the difference between, this inert stone and this snail? Well, living beings move. They respond to stimuli, they reproduce, they grow, and they're dependent on their environment. They need energy. And this is the case for you, for me, for animals, plants, and also a lot of other organisms you may never have heard about. Let's meet some of them.
Many of us think of the sky as a mixture of inanimate entities: oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, ozone. But that's not all. There's pollen, algae, and bacteria swept up by the wind, and that makes up 20% of the mass of the sky. These little bacteria can even influence the weather by triggering rain or snow, which means our life is affected by them, maybe even depends on them. Take a minute to observe the tree leaves overhead. Whereas other living beings need to eat to ingest other living beings, eat other plants or animals to survive, these small leaves rely just on the sun, the air, and the water for their survival. Plus, even though they seem immobile, by releasing their pollen up into the atmosphere, these giant trees can reproduce. Take a closer look at the tree's trunk and you find it's home to more than 300 species. Perhaps the most interesting place, though, is under the ground. That's where the interconnections happen, where fungus and tree roots fuse and create mycorrhizae, a network of roots that enable both the trees and the fungus to absorb more nutrients. And even better, this underground network is thought to be one of the ways trees communicate with each other, a sort of wood wide web. If you keep digging a few meters deeper, you meet the Earth's recyclers. Keep digging. 5 kilometers under our feet, there is no light, no oxygen, very few nutrients, and temperatures rise to 120 degrees. But yet, life exists. These very strange creatures, nicknamed microbial dark matter, could live thousands of years, feeding themselves with the energy of the rocks. In fact, they represent 70% of all bacteria and archaea on Earth. And we only just discovered them. To end this marvelous guided tour of Earth's biodiversity, may I suggest you explore your own guts? The microbiota is the home of 1,000 species of bacteria and yeasts. Clearly, it's time to stop thinking of yourself as an independent human being. You are just a giant bus for bacteria.
Welcome back. In the previous video, we started to appreciate quite how much life there is on our planet, quite how much biodiversity there is. It's a monumental task to try to organise that biodiversity, but it has been done. Zoomed right out, all that life is organised into huge domains. All the life inside each domain is split into kingdoms. A kingdom's biodiversity is split into a number of phyla, those into classes, and those into orders. And there are still 3 more levels of classification. Orders are split into families, those into genuses, and finally, the most detailed, most precise way of grouping life, species. Current estimates for the number of species on Earth are 5.3 million to 1 trillion. That is quite the range, because not only do scientists disagree on an exact definition of what a species actually is, and therefore often what species something should fall under, but they're also discovering new species all the time, at a rate of roughly 18,000 species a year. Researchers in Los Angeles, for example, recently found 30 new species of scuttlefly living in urban parks. And some other scientists recently discovered more than 1,400 new species of bacteria living in the belly button of university students. So, while our estimate of the number of species on the planet remains frustratingly imprecise, the one thing we can be more certain of is that we have named and described only a tiny percentage of living things. And all those living things, all that biodiversity, is at stake, because everything is connected. Look at my terrarium. There are the snails, the plants, all the little critters in the soil. It's an ecosystem, a biological community of organisms interacting with each other and their environment. Ecosystems can be smaller than this, perhaps even just one drop of water. Or they can be much, much larger, like our whole Earth. In fact, my hand has an ecosystem of its own. At least 160 different species of bacteria interact together right here. There is clearly ecosystem diversity, but each ecosystem finds its place on the planet in relation to the others, and each plays its part. Remember, forests and oceans play a role in the carbon cycle. Oceans regulate Earth's climate. Wetlands help prevent floods and clean water. Each of these ecosystems interacts with the others. My hand interacts with the terrarium. We're all interacting in this studio. diversity also clearly occurs within the number of species in each ecosystem. As I mentioned, in the ecosystem of the Earth, there's anything from 5.3 million to 1 trillion different species. Within this spoonful of soil, there could be several thousand different species of bacteria, 1 million single-cell organisms, 1 million fungi. Where on Earth has the greatest diversity of known species? Well, for fun, let's follow just one meridian, one imaginary line that runs vertically up the Earth from pole to pole, one longitude. Let's go for the meridian 73 degrees west of Greenwich, and we'll go from North Pole to the equator. You won't see any trees or plants before we travel 800 kilometres south. The first plants to appear are the Arctic willow, which don't grow higher than your ankle. It's not until 3,400 kilometres south that you're going to be able to see the gigantic boreal forest. Absolutely stunning, but it only has 20 different tree species in 4 million square kilometres. As we continue south along this line of longitude, we enter the US, and the diversity of trees starts to increase. 50 different species in Vermont. Then further south in North Carolina, there are more than 200. In Belize, there are 700. In Peru, scientists have counted more than 1,000 different species of trees. And what is true for trees is true for global species diversity. The general rule is that diversity is poor at the pole and rich near the equator. And scientists still argue about why. Some say it's because tropical equatorial regions have flourished longer than regions in the north, which were covered with snow for long periods. Others think it's because temperatures are more stable in the south, so small variations can lead to species differentiations. If you want to learn more about this, you can go read Elizabeth Colbert's great book, The Sixth Extinction and Unnatural History. Oh, by the way, here's something you can try at home to figure out the quality of your garden's species diversity. Take a piece of fabric, preferably a natural fabric containing no chemicals, and plant it in your garden. I've used a cotton pad like this. Okay. Now, be sure to mark where you planted it with a small sign, like a flag. Otherwise, you may never find it again. Okay. Then you wait. A few weeks later, dig it up. The more damaged it is, the less tissue that remains, the better the quality of species diversity in your garden. If it's intact, well, that's not good news. The soil in your garden is probably very poor. But why is species diversity so important? Well, because each species is dependent on the others. And this interdependence is particularly significant when we think about a food chain or food web, the who eats who relationships. And that is what our next video is all about. Welcome back. This video will help you get to grips with why it's so important to have so many species, so much biodiversity. And we're starting off with food chains and food webs. I'm going to construct a simplified food chain of a small lake. At the base of any food chain, you've got the primary producers, the plants and the phytoplankton in the water. They don't eat anyone, they use the sunlight and the nutrients in the soil or in the water to grow. Then come the primary consumers. They're vegetarians, like the zooplankton in the water, for example, or little aphids on the leaves of our plants, or dragonflies. They are in turn eaten by secondary consumers or tertiary consumers, like the snake. Then here come the apex predators, the animals at the very top of the food chain. They eat everything and everyone, but are never eaten by anyone. Near the lake, a fox is the apex predator, or maybe us humans. Now actually, the last and very important category we need to add to this biodiversity picture we're painting is the decomposers. Organisms that break down organic material and waste when it dies. The decomposers fertilise the soil. They provide nutrients for plants to grow. Here's the thing though, a change in one link can affect the whole food chain and thus the whole ecosystem. Scientists initially thought that it was the primary producers who were controlling the whole food chain. But in the 1950s, a new idea emerged that the apex predators may play an important role. In 1960, the zoologist and ecologist Dr. Robert Payne tested this theory. He went to Near Bay in Washington. He carefully studied the whole food chain and discovered that starfish were in fact the apex predators. Yeah, they may seem pretty inoffensive to you and me, but when you take a moment to observe them, as Dr. Payne did, you quickly realise they're deadly hunters. They love to eat mussels. To find out the starfish's effect on the food chain, Robert carefully, patiently collected them all and moved them elsewhere. And guess what? After a year and a half, the whole environment of the bay changed. There were mussels everywhere. In fact, after 7 years, the mussels had pushed everybody else out. Removing the starfish, that previous apex predator, had changed the nature of the whole system. Removing the starfish had caused what's known as a trophic cascade, a series of impacts on the numbers of the various predators and prey in the food chain. This made the starfish a keystone species, one whose removal would cause this trophic cascade. And starfish aren't the only keystone species, of course. Others elsewhere include phytoplankton, sea otters, beavers, wolves, elephants, prairie dogs, bees, and many, many more. When an apex predator is no longer around, the population of their herbivorous prey begins to boom. Without a top predator to regulate their numbers, these guys multiply and put a great deal of pressure on the existing vegetation that they require for food. A pressure that can lead to the destruction of large amounts of plant life, such as grasses and trees. This then causes further problems such as soil erosion and the loss of habitats. Here's an example. In some part of Africa, lions and leopards have become scarce. As the number of these apex predators has declined, numbers of their prey, the olive baboons, increased. Olive baboons are omnivorous, and their menu includes eating deer and local monkeys. As olive baboon numbers rose, populations of local monkeys and deer plummeted. So olive baboons had to find another source of food. They started raiding the fields, eating livestock and crops. And this increased their human contact and led to the increase of something else: intestinal parasites. One change leads to many changes, which is why the greater the diversity of species inside an ecosystem, the better the ecosystem will be able to respond to external pressures and threats. This interdependency is a lot more diverse than just the food web. A good way to see this interdependence is to explore one of the most diverse ecosystems in the ocean, the coral reefs.
What an incredible spectacle. They look like plants, but corals are actually part of the animal kingdom. Corals are composed of hundreds of thousands of individual animals called polyps that actually produce that stony substance. And also an algae called zooanthellae. It's the relationship between the coral and the algae that is the secret of the coral reefs. Thanks to the polyps, the algae benefits from not just the protective environment of that stony structure, but also the compounds it needs for photosynthesis. In return, the algae provides oxygen. It also helps the coral to remove waste, and the waste products of photosynthesis provide essential nutrients that are necessary for the corals to grow. This clever collaboration between some of the tiniest ocean animals and plants has been ongoing for some 25 million years, and it's helped make coral reefs the largest structures of biological origin on Earth. Structures that provide habitats, hiding places, and breeding grounds for 4,000 species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks, and at least 800 species of harder corals. And scientists estimate there could be millions more undiscovered species relying on corals.
Welcome back. There's another kind of diversity that I need to tell you about, the genetic diversity within a species. Genes are like the words in the instruction manual of life. Your genes tell your body how to make proteins, little molecular machines you need to function. Let's say these are a species of dog, and they're all green because they share a lot of the same characteristics. They have a lot of the same genes. There's very little genetic diversity, which means they'll have very similar reactions to similar stimuli. That was a stairs now. These dogs, on the other hand, are more genetically diverse. Their genes are very different, which means they will react differently to the same stimuli. So now let's pretend that my hand is a disease that attacks dogs. And these green dogs, they carry some of the genes that make them vulnerable to the disease. Now, if the members of the species are very genetically similar, they're going to respond very similarly, which means if they cannot cope with the disease, it will likely spread very easily and it may even wipe out the whole species. The more genetic diversity a species has, the more likely it is that some of its members will be able to resist a change in the environment and survive. We humans have been playing a lot with the genes of the living things that surround us, playing dangerous games and putting genetic diversity at risk. Wheat is a good example. Over thousands of years, we humans have selected the wheat that was the most nourishing, the strongest, the one that would yield the best flour. Other wild wheat plants existed, but they have long disappeared. We've done the same things with horses, cows, dogs, pigs, and our livestock. We selected the best breeds of cattle, and that led many others to become extinct. We now breed a lot of cattle. Actually, if we took the mass of all the cattle that we breed, it would be 14 times bigger than the mass of all of the wild mammals. Through the artificial selection of wheat, cattle, and many other species, humans have been reducing the genetic diversity of life. Here's an example. Many types of bananas exist, but you probably only eat one variety. The Cavendish. The Cavendish was actually created by humans through artificial selection. It was then cloned and reproduced in a laboratory to be sent to plantations worldwide. The Cavendish is so good looking. It's a lovely yellow banana. It tastes nice and sweet. Hang on. And compared to lots of other types of banana, it doesn't turn brown or black very fast. It's a beautiful product made for exportation. but it's under threat. A fungus called Fusarium has started to destroy the plants in East Asia, and now it's spread to South America. The Caribbean is waiting in fear. They know they are at risk because there is no genetic diversity. If the Fusarium killed the Asian bananas, it would also kill the Caribbean ones because they're the same plant. That lack of genetic diversity could mean the end of all Cavendish bananas. Scientists know it too, and they're racing against the fungus to find a new variety of banana that will stand up to it. So, what have we discovered? There is a lot of biodiversity. Just how much? We don't know. But we do know that organisms and ecosystems interact in complex ways, and the more diverse the ecosystem, the species or its genes, the more resilient the system will be. Next, we're moving on to how life can change and adapt. But first, it's the quiz. Hey there. Now you've mastered the concepts of biodiversity, ecosystems, and food webs, you understand how everything is interconnected. So we're now going to look at how this process is a dynamic one. Once a mineral is used up, it's gone for good. But in the living world, well, it's more of a dynamic balance. Like me, trying to slackline. You have to move my arms and my legs a little bit left, a little bit right. I'm moving all the time. There's an equilibrium. It's constantly evolving. It's dynamic. And in the living world, the same things happen. Take a tree. The more wood-boring beetles there are in it, the more woodpeckers come to eat them. But the more woodpeckers eat, well, the fewer wood-boring beetles there are. So some hungry woodpeckers leave. But then, the fewer the number of woodpeckers, the more wood-boring beetles can reproduce before being eaten. So, more beetles. And you know what's going to happen next, don't you? Nature, biodiversity is not fixed. But this is actually a rather new idea in the science of natural history. Let me take a few minutes to tell you the story of how we came to understand the concept of evolution. Humans have always given names to the animals and plants that they encountered. Navajo Indians identified more than 500 plants. Tribes in New Guinea had names for 137 different birds. Aristotle, 300-ish years BCE, he classified the animals around him. And then Pliny the Elder continued Aristotle's work with the encyclopedia The Natural History of Pliny the Elder. It was a bestseller in Europe until the 17th century, in fact. But Pliny was definitely not a fact-checker. No, in his encyclopedia you can find very detailed information on the alkis, a kind of elk with a very large upper lip that walks backwards. In the 18th century, along comes Carl Linnaeus. He was the first to properly organise the natural world, to set up rankings, a taxonomy. However, not he nor anyone before him imagined that life could change, could evolve. That same century, giant bones and teeth were discovered in the USA. For years, scientists argued whether they belonged to a giant elephant or a hippopotamus. The unknown from Ohio, as it was called, was so big it didn't fit any existing species. The Comte de Ba-Thong, a noted natural sciences researcher of the time, and later paleontologist Georges Cuvier, came up with the groundbreaking idea that these bones belonged to an extinct species. Cuvier called it the mastodon. The idea that species could be born and then disappear was a revolution. It was to say that nature was not unchanging, was not immutable. In 1825, a young Charles Darwin, with Cuvier's book tucked under his arm, embarks on his epic journey aboard the HMS Beagle. a journey to the coast of South America that would forever change our understanding of nature. On board, he became passionate about studying every plant and animal he found. As famously told, in the Galapagos, Darwin was intrigued by the finches. He observed that on each island, the shapes and the sizes of their beaks were slightly different. And he suggested that those different beaks belonged to different species who had evolved to best suit their environment. It took Darwin until 1859 to publish his famous essay On the Origin of Species, in which he developed the theory of the survival of the fittest. The idea that those best adapted for their environment survive, passing their traits on to the next generation. Let's take an example, giraffes. Today they are around 5.8 metres high. They weigh in at around 2 tonnes and they can run close to 60 kilometres an hour. Giraffes are the tallest bovine animals and their ancestors date back 20 million years. And how long were their necks then? Much shorter. Why? Well, the giraffes who had long necks could reach up to the fresh leaves that shorter giraffes couldn't. Those shorter giraffes might not get enough food and might die. That is natural selection. The long-necked giraffes were stronger, they were fitter, and they survived. They reproduced and they passed on their genes, those instructions, to their offspring for growing longer necks. But as more slightly longer-necked giraffes were born, it was the even longer-necked giraffes who had the advantage. According to Darwin, over many, many generations, the population evolved slowly to have longer and longer necks, eventually having such differences from where they started to be considered a new species. According to Darwin, biodiversity results from a subtle combination of isolation and interconnection. The organisms involved must be sufficiently isolated from each other to differentiate according to their environments. But there needs to be a sufficient exchange between them to ensure they don't lose their genetic diversity and come a cropper from a disease or whatever. Later in the early 20th century, the discovery of genetics and DNA backed up Darwin's ideas. So, this theory of evolution through natural selection showed that life evolves over time. It adapts to different environments and to different interactions among organisms. Biodiversity is the result of adaptation, and the genes of a species contain its entire history of adaptation. Spiders existed 300 million years ago. They developed adaptation skills in order to survive dinosaurs, volcanic eruptions, and ice ages. They evolved to use silk webs to catch their prey, and those adaptations enabled their survival. The living world is a complex, dynamic system. Pressures for food, light, space leads to some species becoming extinct naturally, whereas others remain but evolve into different forms. Biodiversity is the outcome of all of these combined actions of emergence, extinctions, and the divergence of lineages. Each of these is a key mechanism we need to preserve if we want to keep our biodiversity. Most species appear to have a natural lifespan of 5 to 10 million years before they disappear. In fact, 90 to 99% of all the species that have ever existed on Earth have gone extinct. Sometimes, though, these changes are more brutal, as we will explore in the next video. Welcome back. So far we've seen that the living world is a dynamic world. Species evolve and adapt, and sometimes if changes occur too rapidly for them to do just that, species go extinct. That's happened in extremes a number of times in Earth's history, with 5 major extinctions wiping out at least 75% of all species. And figures today suggest we are currently witnessing another mass extinction, and it's happening faster than the others. But the big difference today is that this mass extinction isn't caused by a natural disaster, it's humans. Remember, in our 24-hour version of the epic history of Earth, the first hominids appeared at 3 minutes to midnight, Neanderthals at 1 minute to midnight, and modern humans, Homo sapiens, didn't emerge until 7 seconds to midnight. However, in those 7 seconds, in just 300,000 years, we have changed our planet profoundly. Scientists call this era the Anthropocene, the time where we can clearly see the effects that humans have had on weather and climate. Beginning around 200 years ago, the effects of this Anthropocene era are so big that they're currently creating a geological layer, a layer in the rock, that will remain for millions of years after our own extinction. Sapiens managed to become apex predators. Having no competitors left, they expanded in a very, very short time. Too short, in fact, for the biosphere, for the Earth's ecosystems to adapt, to migrate, to evolve. Our human activities have severely altered 75% of the terrestrial environment and 66% of the marine environment. The two major causes that impact biodiversity are land use and the overexploitation of resources. Those two are responsible for half of all biodiversity loss. This is what happens when humans take land for agriculture or for building homes. Today, converting lands for crops and grazing is the cause of 80% of deforestation on Earth, destroying habitats for around 500,000 species. When your habitat is facing destruction, what choices do you have? Well, you've got two: adapt or move. Or there's a third, I guess, just die. We've seen how some changes have happened too quickly to be able to adapt. So what about move? Well, the problem today is that our land use has caused fragmentation of ecosystems. By building a road or a farm, we create new frontiers that species sometimes can't cross. For example, frogs. When they come out of their hibernation, they go to a wetland to reproduce. If a big road blocks their way, then they'll still cross it, but then they're likely going to end up being squashed by a car. Fragmentation also threatens the genetic diversities of species, making reproduction difficult. The overexploitation of animals, plants, and other organisms through harvesting, logging, hunting, and fishing has a huge impact on biodiversity too. Let's look at one specific example: the cod industry.
Not so long ago, the entire economies of coastal towns in northwest Europe and northeast Canada depended on cod, that versatile fish that lives on ocean floors and shows up everywhere, from British fish and chips to Portuguese bacalhau. For centuries, fleets left for months at a time to harvest the rich sandbanks in the North Atlantic. Thanks to new technologies and modern equipment, by 1970, about 800,000 tons of codfish was taken every year. But because of that overfishing, a steep decline began. There was even a near war fought between Britain and Iceland over the dwindling stocks. By 1990, some fisheries had collapsed to zero. Canada banned cod fishing off Newfoundland in the hope stocks would recover, but they didn't. The European Union instituted a series of plans and quota systems to preserve the species near its waters. Stocks recovered in some zones, but others remain near zero. Cod, once a cheap and plentiful fish that provided a livelihood for seaside towns and protein and nutrition across much of Europe, has now become a rare and expensive delicacy. Whole communities have been devastated. And it's not just cod. worldwide, 33% of fish stocks are overfished. They're being taken out of the sea at a rate that doesn't allow the species to replenish.
So 50% of biodiversity loss is down to humans' land use and the over-exploitation of resources. What's responsible for the other half? Well, we'll find out the answers in the next video. Welcome back. Let's meet Dr. Emma Camp. Emma is a leading researcher at the University of Technology in Sydney. She's also a diver and has discovered something very special about the coral and its reaction to stress.
It's a long coral reef in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but it's also the research field of Dr. Emma Camp, a leading scientist on coral conservation and resilience.
When I was a child, I got to see a coral reef. I just couldn't believe that there was life under the water, and I just thought it was amazing and beautiful, and the fact that it's just this whole different world just fascinated me.
But this incredible spectacle of nature is dying because of climate change. Warm seawater, which is more acidic and less oxygenated, has a major impact on algae's life.
Unfortunately, whilst the microalgae are super important for the coral because they actually photosynthesize and give the coral a lot of its food, when conditions are stressful, the algae actually is no longer beneficial to the coral and they get expelled and the corals turn white, hence why we say coral bleaching. And that breakdown in that essential relationship is often triggered by thermal anomalies, which we're seeing intensify under climate change.
And it happens in the blink of an eye. Emma saw it for herself in 2016.
And I was actually in the Seychelles on a research trip when the bleaching event hit there. And in a matter of a couple of weeks, I actually saw a really vibrant, healthy coral system turn completely white. It's just like a really kind of eerie sight. And then ultimately transition to mortality. So then, it was just like a coral graveyard. And, we're not talking about a few corals, we're talking about as far as you could see in all directions. So, several football pitches in size of habitat just lost.
The problem is, the death of corals endangers the entire marine ecosystem.
If we lose the reef, then once that live coral cover goes, then that habitat is often, it's at least severely degraded. So they will have to move to find another home, for example. And some species have very specific habitats. So if you think about anemone fish, for example, if we lose anemones on a coral reef, they're not going to be able to survive without finding another anemone to move to. And if they've all been bleached and wiped out, then arguably, that species isn't going to survive. So really, that loss of habitat in terms of the structure of the reef really has a knock-on effect on all of the organisms that are found in that system.
But Emma observed even more. The extinction of corals endangers humans.
On top of that, actually, if we take, land, for example, the coral reefs are the first barrier and form of protection to stop coastal erosion and severe storm damage. So if we lose coral reefs, we lose that buffering capacity that it produces. On top of that, from an intrinsic value, even for us as humans, they have a huge economic value through tourism and through the products that are found on coral reefs. Furthermore, if we think about coral reefs, they also play an important role in nutrient cycling in oceans as a whole.
Emma studies areas like mangrove lagoons to understand how the corals develop in hostile and acidic environments. Then she transplants supercorals in devastated reefs as the surgeon replaces diseased organs with healthy ones.
The fact that we've discovered corals capable of doing that, it's transforming our understanding of how corals can survive into the future.
Welcome back. So far we've seen that the living world is a dynamic world. Species evolve and adapt, and sometimes if changes occur too rapidly for them to do just that, species go extinct. That's happened in extremes a number of times in Earth's history, with 5 major extinctions wiping out at least 75% of all species. And figures today suggest we are currently witnessing another mass extinction, and it's happening faster than the others. But the big difference today is that this mass extinction isn't caused by a natural disaster, it's humans. Remember, in our 24-hour version of the epic history of Earth, the first hominids appeared at 3 minutes to midnight, Neanderthals at 1 minute to midnight, and modern humans, Homo sapiens, didn't emerge until 7 seconds to midnight. However, in those 7 seconds, in just 300,000 years, we have changed our planet profoundly. Scientists call this era the Anthropocene, the time where we can clearly see the effects that humans have had on weather and climate. Beginning around 200 years ago, the effects of this Anthropocene era are so big that they're currently creating a geological layer, a layer in the rock, that will remain for millions of years after our own extinction. Sapiens managed to become apex predators. Having no competitors left, they expanded in a very short time. Too short, in fact, for the biosphere, for the Earth's ecosystems to adapt, to migrate, to evolve. Our human activities have severely altered 75% of the terrestrial environment and 66% of the marine environment. The 2 major causes that impact biodiversity are land use and the overexploitation of resources. Those 2 are responsible for half of all biodiversity loss. This is what happens when humans take land for agriculture or for building homes. Today, converting lands for crops and grazing is the cause of 80% of deforestation on Earth, destroying habitats for around 500,000 species. When your habitat is facing destruction, what choices do you have? We've got 2, adapt or move. Or there's a third, I guess, just die. We've seen how some changes have happened too quickly to be able to adapt. So what about move? Well, the problem today is that our land use has caused fragmentation of ecosystems. By building a road or a farm, we create new frontiers that species sometimes can't cross. For example, frogs. When they come out of their hibernation, they go to a wetland to reproduce. If a big road blocks their way, then they'll still cross it, but then they're likely going to end up being squashed by a car. Fragmentation also threatens the genetic diversities of species, making reproduction difficult. The overexploitation of animals, plants, and other organisms through harvesting, logging, hunting, and fishing has a huge impact on biodiversity too. Let's look at one specific example, the cod industry.
Not so long ago, the entire economies of coastal towns in northwest Europe and northeast Canada depended on cod, that versatile fish that lives on ocean floors and shows up everywhere, from British fish and chips to Portuguese bacalhau. For centuries, fleets left for months at a time to harvest the rich sandbanks in the North Atlantic. Thanks to new technologies and modern equipment, by 1970, about 800,000 tons of codfish was taken every year. But because of that overfishing, a steep decline began. There was even a near war fought between Britain and Iceland over the dwindling stocks. By 1990, some fisheries had collapsed to zero. Canada banned cod fishing off Newfoundland in the hope stocks would recover, but they didn't. The European Union instituted a series of plans and quota systems to preserve the species near its waters. Stocks recovered in some zones, but others remain near zero. Cod, once a cheap and plentiful fish that provided a livelihood for seaside towns and protein and nutrition across much of Europe, has now become a rare and expensive delicacy. Whole communities have been devastated. And it's not just cod. Worldwide, 33% of fish stocks are overfished. They're being taken out of the sea at a rate that doesn't allow the species to replenish.
So 50% of biodiversity loss is down to humans' land use and the over-exploitation of resources. What's responsible for the other half? Well, we'll find out the answers in the next video. So 50% of biodiversity loss is down to humans' land use and the over-exploitation of resources. What's responsible for the other half? Well, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. Temperature increases in the sea and on land affect species. 1 degree warmer and migratory birds lay their eggs 2 days earlier than normal. It's a small change, but it can mean that when they hatch, there's less food available for the baby birds. Green turtles are affected by temperature too. The sex of a turtle is determined by the temperature of the sand while their eggs are incubating. Low temperatures lead to male turtles and higher temperatures produce females. A study carried out on Ingram Island off Australia showed that sea turtles from the largest colony of green turtles in the Pacific Ocean already had a ratio of at least 116 females to 1 male. Which could mean within just a few years there may be no males left to reproduce. The sea turtles will soon perish. How can species adapt to such changes? As we said, there are 2 strategies: adapt or move. Plants bloom earlier and earlier each year, and pollinators have to adapt, moving elsewhere or changing the time or frequency of pollination. This adaptation to rising temperatures can be tricky for many species because climate change is happening so quickly. If they can't adapt to changes in their environment, then they have to migrate. But species don't migrate with the same speed. Split-hoofed mammals like deer, antelope, pigs, sheep, they are slowly moving, they're migrating to escape the climate change. They shift around 60 kilometers each decade. But it's not just the animals that are moving. Some trees do too, kind of. I mean, the trunks don't up and walk, but where their seeds are dispersed and germinate, that's shifting about 1 to 2 kilometers every decade to escape the climate change. Adaptation and migration are a matter of speed. If species aren't able to cope with that speed, if they can't move out of the way of the increased climate change in time, they'll go extinct. There's another factor leading to species extinction too: pollution. Let's take the example of neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids are the most widely available family of insecticides in the world today. These pesticides are called systemic. They penetrate the whole plant, which is part of their success and their danger. When pollinators, such as bees, forage for flowers, they face serious damage. The neonicotinoids can lead to slowed development, to malformations, to the loss of orientation, to the inability to recognize flowers, weakened immune defenses, so much. 80,000 bees can die from the effects of a single grain of corn coated with 0.5 milligram of clothianidin, a pesticide of the neonicotinoid family. My terrarium is not looking so well. Someone's been using it as a bin. Okay, they haven't, and the critters in there are all right, I've taken them out. But what we should talk about is waste, because it's a big problem. Plastic pollution in the oceans has increased tenfold since 1980. There are now 110 million tons of plastic in the ocean. That kills marine species, but it also threatens us humans too. Plastic accumulates up the food chain, potentially carrying toxins too. A university in Australia estimated that each week, through eating food or drinking water that's contaminated with plastics, we could each be consuming around 5 grams of plastic, the equivalent of a credit card's worth. Another human threat to biodiversity is our tendency to introduce invasive species. Every day, largely through trade or tourism, hundreds of species are introduced into areas where they've not been before, that they aren't native. Take the black rat, for example. It's among the world's most invasive species, having spread across the globe alongside the spread of human settlements. It's also the source of some of the worst diseases that affect humans. Plus, it's thought to have had a devastating impact on native wildlife, especially in island ecosystems such as Australia and the Pacific Islands. It's time to open our eyes. Look at my terrarium. It is completely destroyed. There's no more space. There's no more diversity. This is what our planet looks like right now, like a trash can. Has our planet reached a tipping point? Is our ecosystem able to adapt to the changes we've imposed on it? Well, we'll find out the answers in the next video. Welcome back. Whenever I look at this destroyed terrarium, it hurts me. But this is what we have done to our planet through the excessive land use, through overexploitation of resources, the increased pollution, the spread of invasive species, and of course, the human-caused rapid climate change. And all these factors have led to what's being called a 6th mass extinction happening right now, a collapse of biodiversity. Is our Earth's ecosystem able to adapt to the changes we've imposed on it? Well, let's ask an expert. Dr. Gerardo Ceballos is a renowned scientist. He's studied, among other things, the jaguar population in Mexico. And in 2015, Gerardo formally stated that we have entered the 6th mass extinction. Hi, Gerardo.
Hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Tell me more about the 6th mass extinction. What led you to say that it is happening now?
The story of determining that we have entered the 6th mass extinction is very interesting, Greg. In 2010, we published a paper saying that we thought we have entered the 6th mass extinction because of the extinction rates were really strong, but we didn't have really solid data to compare current extinction rates to past extinction rates. I mean, during normal times, there's a certain number of species become extinct because of natural selection and so on. And then one day I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was telling me of a paper that he has published recently where he and his colleague were able to show what was the extinction rate in the last million years for mammals. And I was immediately incredibly interested to find out. And he said, yes, Gerardo, this means that during normal times, in the last few million years, you will expect to lose 2 species every 100 years for every 10,000 species present. So I run out at my office, get out my data, and start to look at that. The bottom line was that when we find out that the number of species lost in the last 100 years would have taken 10,000 years under the normal extinction rate. That's the magnitude of the problem.
Wow, so that would make the extinction rate today 100 times faster than it should be, yeah? And is it speeding up?
In a recent paper that we published last year, we have shown that it's not only happening, but it's accelerating. It is accelerating. In the last 5-7 years, the data shows that many more species are becoming extinct. In other words, that the rate of extinction is higher, much higher. So finally, in terms of geological time, this is an instant extinction. It's so fast. And I give you an example. At the beginning of the 1900s, there used to be 10 million elephants. At the beginning of the 21st century, there were around 500,000. Now there is between 250 and 300,000. We lose an elephant illegally killed every half an hour. And if this continues, we will not have a wild elephant in 10, 12 years.
Oh, this is so hard to hear. And Gerardo, I presume that it was these rates of loss of biodiversity that led you to use this term annihilation?
It's a biological annihilation because basically our activities are impacting all kinds of species from everywhere, from plants and animals, and even microorganisms. So we call it biological annihilation. What is happening in the next 15 years will define the fate of most species of wild plants and animals on Earth, on the one hand, but it will also define the future of humanity and if we are going to collapse or not in the next decades.
The collapse of humanity, what would that look like?
It is very likely that it will be a collapse of civilization in the next 30 years. A collapse of civilization is basically erosion of the social, the political, and the economic way that we have done business and we are used to because of environmental problems. In other words, it can be a really horrible, really dramatic future.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Gerardo. This is all truly worrying, right? It feels to me like we've reached a tipping point in this incredibly dynamic system. A sixth extinction is here, and our impact, increased climate change, biodiversity loss, it's accelerating. Our activities have led to rapid changes in the environment which are occurring way too fast for many species to adapt or migrate. We've transformed the living world we live in into a trash can, a cemetery almost. This sixth extinction is massive, it's rapid, and it's obvious. Imagine a gigantic library burning, a library full of books, the books of life. As each book burns, precious information on how to live in a specific environment, how to breathe, fly, communicate, that goes up in flames. All of this information, built upon billions of years of evolution, vanishes like that. The sixth extinction annihilates the present, but also the past developments of a species too, all of its history. And it annihilates its possibility for evolution in the future. Each mass extinction was followed by a renewal of life and biodiversity, but that always took several million years to happen. One sliver of good news here is that our species has the power to understand, to change what's happening. We have seen how Dr. Emma Camp is studying coral resilience. She can understand how coral reacts to stress and try to preserve some of them too. Dr. Gerardo Ceballos also told me some positive news about jaguars. They are part of our world. Or perhaps even more so, we're part of theirs. We rely on the biodiversity around us. It's that biodiversity that gives us access to food, to medicine, to technology. It also protects and maintains the environment that we need to survive. But we're not doing enough to protect it. A tipping point has already been reached for many, many species, but perhaps we can do something for those that haven't been pushed too far from equilibrium.